Well, it's very nice to be with you again. I find it very energizing to be with this group who does really lift me up when I come, so even at Mass. Now, one thing about my background I like to mention is it really influenced my theology, and it really influenced even the way that I'm going to be giving these talks. Besides the appointments you mentioned, I also spent 5 years in the Hill District at Old St. Richard's Parish, okay, before the merger. And it really taught me a lot about reality, keeping down to earth. And I'll never forget, because I'm going to get to this in my third talk, and maybe even a little bit tonight, this notion of how, since Vatican II, we depend a lot less on philosophy and much more on experience. Well, one of the Baptist ministers told me the story, and I think it was a true story. One of their young, newly ordained men, and they become pastors right away, became a pastor in inner city parish. He was very talented, very bright, and he had a great personality. He could work with kindergarten kids, the old people. He could work very well with those tough neighborhood hoodlums and hoods and everything, and really bring them around. He was great with everyone. Well, he was so good that there were a couple members of the parish who said, this young man should really become a leader in our church. And two of the people in that inner city parish, it wasn't the Hill District, had been to Harvard. So they said, we're going to start talking to a few people out there, and what if after he's a couple of years here, we could get him into a Master of Divinity program at Harvard, so we'd climb up the ladder in our whole constituency. Well, after several years there, they'd even raised money for a scholarship for him. And according to this minister, they said Harvard would accept him if he passed certain tests that they had. So they presented this to him. Well, when they presented it to him, he was really taken aback. And he said, I can't believe you're doing this. He said, but there's no way I could say no after what you have done here, and I'm very grateful. But I myself don't look like wanting to advance up the ladder. But that's fine. He said, but I'm going to make one condition right now. Well, they were a little surprised. And you know what his condition was? He said, if I get a Master of Divinity from Harvard, I come back and serve this parish for another 5 years in the inner city. Well, they were very impressed. He actually went to Harvard, according to this man, came back, and he said when he came back, he still, even the Harvard degree, had the same capacity to relate to those rough hoodlum kids, the same capacity to relate to those little first graders and the older people, all those skills, but only one thing changed. Every now and then, he spoke with Harvard language. Now, I'm sure this minister was exaggerating a bit, but he said one of his first sermons sounded something like this. Now, I spent many years in the Hill, and I started to talk a little bit like that, so I'm going to imitate the sermon. Brothers and sisters, I sense in this community an existential angst. And people looked at him. And I fear that it is coming from a certain kind of eschatological depression. And they said, talk about it, brother, talk about it. He said, and I fear that we are headed towards a cataclysmic eruption. And at that point, an old woman got up in the back of the church and she said, Reverend Nani, you better put them cookies on a lower shelf. That really taught me a lot, even when I write. And I don't know if any of you, I wouldn't expect you to know this. It is very difficult to find standard philosophical language especially, from Thomas Aquinas and so on, in any of the council documents. I think there really was a dramatic change towards experience. How do things touch us? And that's a lot of the point that I'm going to make tonight in my second talk here. Now, as your outline said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Mass first evolved in those first centuries. And remember I said this last month when I came, that my point in doing this is, naturally it's going to be interesting to learn some of this history, but that's not my point. I have tried to select things that I think could be helpful to think about and wonder about, and maybe even move us in a little different direction here in the 21st century. Now, that's what I tried to do last time. I'm going to do it in all 5 talks. Okay. So, see if that really works for you. And I'm going to point it out sometimes. Here's why we made this change. Do you still feel that that really touches us? Or should we now move in a different direction, or things like that? Okay. Well, at the very beginning, of course, when we first, after Jesus is crucified, very shortly thereafter, the church is under persecution. Remember, the Romans had occupied and very definitely persecuted the church all the way up to the time of Constantine. We usually say the year 312, with his Edict of Milan, it was the end of the persecutions. Now, the way the Mass was handled for the first 300 years is really influenced by the fact that it was difficult to do it publicly because so many were martyrs and so on. Well, the ordinary way that Mass, and of course they didn't call it that then, was celebrated was in the homes of Christians who had a little bit larger homes, and maybe a large living room or a large dining room, where they invited the people who were in their immediate area. So initially, Masses were, now in a way, just what Jesus did. They were a meal. They came together, often in a dining room, around a big table, 30, 40, 50 people, maybe more than that sometimes. Now, of course, that gives you a very exact replication of what Jesus did. So, the first Masses were not as we have it today, neatly at one point we take the bread, take the wine, and so on. They follow much the outline of the Seder meal. They took the bread at the beginning, did say the words of Jesus, "This is my body," took and ate it. Then they had a meal, and do you notice we still use the language from that first century and second century? When supper was ended, the Dedimus Requiem, he then took the chalice. When supper was ended, because that's what they did. The third cup of blessing, which is right near the end, is when Jesus did it at the Last Supper. And I think it's neat we still use that language. Well, that meant there was always this long gathering, 40 minutes in between the bread and the wine. Okay. Now, just as an indication of where their mindset was, what if I asked you this question? Was Jesus present fully when they consecrated the bread? Or did they have to wait until he consecrated the wine also? You know what their answer would be? Don't bother us with that philosophy. Really, there is no philosophizing about that. Jesus is present. We are eating his flesh and drinking his blood. It's only about 1,000 years later, well, a little bit before that, where we try to figure out how does it take place. What was their focus? It was not how. Their focus was, how does this touch us? How does it move us to live? That's what they were interested in, not philosophically saying, is there some internal change in the substance here or something like that? That's much later. Okay. Well, that gives us a beginning idea of the feeling, the sense of the Eucharist at the beginning. Now, actually, and we have some good references for this, in some places, they did start to eliminate the meal in between because sometimes the rich people brought really good food that they didn't share. And it didn't seem like a good community thing. So eventually that's starting to change somewhat, okay? However, in terms of what is the way they are looking at it, the names that they use initially, of course, is not the Mass. That's not until about the 4th century. The terms really tell us something. The breaking of the bread, the supper of the Lord. It is very meal conscious, okay? And that's what the Last Supper was, okay? Now, as I go through this, is that our consciousness today? Does everything about the celebration help us to feel like a meal? Or we'll see throughout the history, as I'll point out tonight and I'll point out in the next lecture, many things happen to change that feeling or sense. Now, we always believed in real presence, but sort of the direction, the way we looked at that, okay, that did begin to change. Well, as what we call now the Thanksgiving prayer, the long prayer, we have 4 choices in the Missal today, okay? That became very prominent. It was called the Roman Canon, C-A-N-O-N. And that term was used to mean, I guess, the typical wording, okay? The Roman Canon. And that's one of the first things that was developed in saying the Mass, okay? And it was used pretty generally, okay? Now, one of the interesting things about that is, now after Vatican II, we changed the Missal dramatically, and we have those 4 choices at the Mass for the Thanksgiving prayer, okay? If you look at the first one, the longest one, believe it or not, that's a variation of the Roman canon from the 2nd century. I guess we just wanted to keep that. The other ones are shorter, okay, a little bit more contemporary, but that one still remains with us. I find that very interesting, okay. Now, before the end of that period, a few other things are added. And one of them is the Lord's Prayer. Now, I did mention this last time, but I think it's worth mentioning again. The Lord's Prayer, we don't often think of it this way, is a prayer with 6 petitions in it. Okay? It's a prayer of petition. And the 6 petitions are after we say, Our Father who art in heaven. Then we pray, let your name be hallowed. Help us hallow and spread your name all over the earth. And then we say, thy kingdom come. Many scholars say that word is better translated reign. Your reign come, because we are praying, oh God, reign over me. Reign within me. Why? So that I may act divinely. And then the 3rd petition is, thy will be done. So that I will do your will. So you see what is happening in the Lord's Prayer. If we understand it in its origins, it's a prayer of petition for intimacy with the divine. And then the 4th one comes, give us this day our daily bread. Now, after what I've said, that doesn't seem to fit. It's not exactly intimate, is it, to say, give us enough to eat 3 times a day. I'll come back to that. Then the last 2 are The petition is, take away the two things that most interfere with this intimacy, sin and temptation. Okay? Now, back to the fourth one. Especially, first time I read this, a fine scripture scholar named Eugene F said, a strange thing happened with the Greek language for that word. When Jesus said it, probably in Aramaic, and then it's translated into Greek, same meaning. And I'm going to say the word in Greek, epiousios. Epi means of or belonging to, ousios is being or substance. He maintains that Jesus actually said, the epitome of intimacy, after he goes through that growing intimacy, let your name be hallowed, okay? Reign over us. Let us do your will and give us the bread of our being. What's the bread of our being in Christianity? The Eucharist. That really makes sense, doesn't it? And then at the end, take away those two things that would interfere with that intimacy. Now, I find a lot of scholars agree with him. Now, it's a long, strange story. I researched this a little bit. How did that word, epiousios, if you look at it in a Greek dictionary today, it says daily. How did it change in that 300-year period? Very interesting. And so when Jerome, in the 5th century, translates it into Latin, of course, he's not examining the history, and he uses quotidianus, daily. I would suggest when you say the Our Father, think of that at Mass. Because we are headed, we have already had that most intimate moment, which is consuming the body and blood of Christ. Okay? And that's what we're saying, the bread of our being. Now, one other interesting thing, in that early form of, and I'll use the proper language, of the breaking of the bread or the supper of the Lord, the kiss of peace was in the Eucharist, was in the ceremony. It's interesting where it was. How does this strike you? Would you ever get on a committee that says, we should change that place? It was right after the readings, because that structure was there originally. Right after the readings and before we bring the bread and wine. And why? To say, through this now we are really one. We are really joined. And they would do the kiss of peace right there before what we would now call the offertory. Does that sound sort of more touching, directional, instead of waiting till the very end at communion time? Okay? But that's why they put it there originally. And by the way, what that did then was kind of sacralize the kiss. Because what happened after that? Well, we kissed the bishop's ring. Are some of you old enough to remember? Don't put your hand up if you are. Okay. Well, and of course we still do this. We kiss the gospel book. Because kiss became a very sacred thing. Okay. And according to the best of the historical scholars, the kiss could have been a kiss on the lips, 2 men or 2 women, actually. Could be eventually, and especially because of Benedictine influence, became a complete embrace. But it was always there, and it was there so that we went into the heart of the supper of the Lord by kissing first and bringing ourselves together. Well, when the change takes place, namely, the persecutions are over in the year 312. Some historians say 313, but Constantine doesn't. Okay? Now Christians are able to worship publicly. Did it ever strike you? Maybe you knew this. There are almost no churches. How could you build a church when persecutions are going on? Now, there was one emperor who allowed them to build 2 or 3. But overall, Christians never worshiped in a church. Well, they're free now. Now, what's the first thing most people do? They look around at the buildings around them and say, is there anything that we could use that maybe would be very helpful? Okay. Well, do you know what building they chose? The law building of the Romans. And do you know what that building was called? This is a fascinating transition language. It was called a basilica. Isn't that amazing? That's how we got the word basilica for a church. Now, its structure was something like this. The reason they chose it, structure was a long building like this. Up front, it was circular. And then it had 2 edges coming out. It looked a little bit cruciform. You know, the big long straight, this, and then the circle at the top. Okay. Well, what it did, of course, did not give any of the feeling of a meal. It gave more the feeling of, if you can picture it like that, you know. And the priest up here, it's almost, now I'm making this comparison, it's almost more like a theater. You know, big congregation here, some on the side, priest up here in front. Now, many suggest that was very influential in changing, not the ultimate meaning, but the feeling about the Mass. And so you probably would no longer call it the Supper of the Lord or the breaking of the bread. What did they start to call it? Well, that Eucharistic prayer, the Roman canon, had been developed. So they started to call it in their own language, Eucharist. Then some others, because it was very clear now that we were focusing on, because the meal in between, of course, had disappeared. Okay? And the structure was largely the long Roman canon, then the consecration, as we call it, Lord's Prayer, and then communion. Okay? So what takes place now is people looking way up there. And of course, there's more people, you needed a bigger room. Okay? But looking at what the priest is doing. Okay? And that starts this new evolution of what Mass is. Well, finally, in the 4th century, some Latin is already in use. At the end of Mass, do some of you remember your Latin really well? The priest would say at the end of Mass, and I said Mass in Latin for 2 years, I think, Ite missa est. Go, you are sent forth. Missa means sending forth. Well, somehow or other, that missa is what led us to calling it the Mass. Okay? And no longer the breaking of the bread, supper of the Lord, and so on. So we were sort of on a new track. Okay? It must have been very difficult in mindsets of the Christians and the bishops at that time of how do we transform from a beautiful dining room where there's clearly a meal to this big basilica building where we got hundreds, maybe 1,000 people. How do we make that transformation? How much does the building influence the transformation? Now, if I would ask you this question, and you don't have to answer out loud unless you'd really like to, okay? We are building churches now. What is the primary purpose of the church in your mind? Just think about that a second. What's the primary purpose when you think about building? Anybody want to say anything out loud?
Hold ceremonies, like the Mass.
Okay, all ceremonies like the Mass. Bringing everyone together. Yes?
Eucharist and community.
Eucharist and community, okay.
create a place for God's presence, for God to be present.
Place where God be present.
I see it as worship God collectively.
Worship God collectively. Okay.
The direction we're supposed to take based on Jesus Christ,
And that is?
listening to the Mass.
Okay, very good. Okay, you're all moving in the right direction. I would say the primary purpose is, you've said it many different ways, a fitting place for the Lord's Supper. Okay? Now, that basilica from that dining room, did we really work on that? A fitting place for a supper. And the many things you said, for the rites and ceremonies and being in the presence of Christ. Okay. Now, that is harder to do. Okay. And especially, it's a difficult problem, especially when you get, instead of 60 people from the local neighborhood, you get 500. But I wonder if it had gone in a different way, and they had picked a different building, would there have been more left of? This is, and what you even said, collectively worshiping at a meal, at a supper. Now, I'm not saying what we did was wrong, but I do think that it was in a bit of a different direction. Now, here's the summary I would make. What is the primary purpose of the church? It is certainly a fitting place for the Eucharist. And I'm going to use the term, the breaking of the bread. Okay, secondly, and you didn't exactly mention this one, it's a way of making a building that gives glory to God, and everybody can see God's glory. Okay? The third thing is, and this one touches us in a way more, it's also a building that sometimes gives us a private place to pray. Okay? That it is sacred. Well, the fourth reason could be an indication that the Christian community is here in this community. Okay. Well, as we look at the history of the building of churches, it seems to me that and I'm going ahead of this time period, but I want to make this point now, that when we made the different kinds of church buildings, that we often went, sometimes very much more, in terms of glorifying God and let everybody see God's glory. Okay? Magnificent church buildings. I don't know if the term Gothic church means anything to you, but it's those churches that have very steep steeples, and maybe 4 or 6 or 8 of those. Okay. Now the reason why they started in France, see, was not Eucharist. It was feel you're soaring up to the divine. And some of the authors say that what should happen when you go inside a Gothic church is this: you walk inside the Gothic church and you go, you almost can't help it. So many of the cathedrals are Gothic churches. Now, I'm going to make this suggestion. I think there is one church like that, maybe many, many in our diocese, but one that is classically like that. You walk in. You know what one that is? Your neighbor, Holy Rosary. Have you ever been in Holy Rosary? Those steep, it's amazing. Now, one of the other things about churches like that, though, whenever you think about community being together, you really need pillars to hold it up. You go in, Holy Rosary Church. We used to estimate as kids, 15% of the pews you couldn't see the altar because of the pillars. But the glory of it. Now, when we got structural steel, that wasn't a problem anymore. Okay. So, I ask you just to ponder that. What might the future hold? Okay. Now, here's one thing that happened after the Second Vatican Council. And I wonder, because this term has disappeared, how many of you remember a term that was used then about making churches sort of more able to people feel collectively together, okay? It was called the fan-shaped church. How many remember that term? Can you just put your hand up? Okay, very small number. Okay, I don't have anything to write here, but it looks like this, okay? The priest in the altar here, and then, not like a circle, and certainly not like a complete circle, which some people said that's the way to get everybody close. If you have a complete circle, what happens? The priest's back is always to a good number of people. I've celebrated Mass sometimes like that. I find it very annoying. The Lord be with you. Well, I do want to look at everybody. The fan-shaped church is, and I'll try to draw it with my hands, okay? You know what a fan looks like when you open it up, okay? So the pews are like this, and then the next one is like this, then the next one, and they're all straight, okay? And they're on three sides. And the first one built here in Pittsburgh also built a balcony with the same fan-shaped pews. Now here was the fascinating result, and that church is still there, by the way. You could fit 1,300 people in that church, and no one was further than 70 feet from the altar. Remarkable thing. What church was it? I love to say this. It was a church that I was first assigned to, but before it was built, and they built it while I was there. And of course, I was instructing. No, I didn't have anything to do with it. But it was built while I was there. And I thought, this is the future. And it's called, and I really suggest you go out and look at it sometime, Our Lady of Grace out in Scott Township.
Miss, when you said it was built
Built
on,
On this fan-shaped notion. It's a fan-shaped church. I thought this is the future. Now, I don't know the whole diocese, and I was out of the diocese teaching at universities. I don't know if there's any other fan-shaped churches. I thought this was going to start something. The people were like 95% enthusiastic about that church. And really, when you were preaching, we made sure even we didn't put the whole of the speaker stand and everything out too far. We kept it back a little bit so that. Now, I always said it this way. I could look at everybody in the church without turning my body, just my head. And I could see 1,300 people, and then sometimes I go. It was remarkable to me. Absolutely remarkable. Now, it's not like the dining room, but I'll tell you, it's as close as anything else that I have felt in terms of bringing the people together. And Bishop Wright was even kind of amazed that we could fit that many people in what was not that enormous a space, but the way that the space was shaped. Well, as we look to the future, I mean, most of our churches are built. I still think it's a valuable thing to think about. Maybe even how we make with some adjustments. One priest in our diocese, here's what he did. His church was one of those, it was a big hall in the school, but it also had those kind of folding walls. Well, for daily Mass, it was a very little job. He had the folding walls closed so that there were only about 10 pews in front. The people at first, a little annoyed, but then they said, we really feel together. So perhaps there are unusual ways that we could do that. One sister's congregation here in Pittsburgh, what they did was they took most of the pews out of their chapel and replaced them with chairs, very comfortable chairs, so they could reshape it with very little problem. Fascinating. And they were all trying to do the same thing. Let's feel together So it's a little bit more like sitting in a big banquet hall. What if initially, instead of the basilica, we had said, we're going to build a church that will look like a big banquet hall for a meal? Okay? And is there anything we can do to evolve that? Okay. Well, another thing that took place after, and it's hard to say when, but started gradually after we came from the house churches into these large buildings, and especially the basilicas. How did the priest get his back to the people? Fascinating how it happened. Now you can see already that the priest is way up there and everybody else is down here. So it's not exactly going to be a terrible thing. Now, one of the ways that happened, and theologically this is pretty good in a way, there was a strong sense that some say came from the Eastern churches, perhaps, but that we should be facing the East, because the East is the rising sun and Jesus is the rising sun. So many churches were built facing the East. And it was not hard for somebody to conclude the priest should be looking east also. Some said the leader who is leading us should be facing the same direction as everybody. Okay? Now that was one reason why it came that way. Okay. Another reason was because, especially if the Gothic church, when they start to begin to be built, the Mass is an awesome mystery. And so, what happened, especially in some of the French churches first, was that the priest would say even the Eucharistic prayer or the Roman canon, rather silent, by himself, with his back to the people. Do you know, when I was first ordained, we were still saying the Roman canon silently, pretty silently. And of course, we were saying it in Latin, so it didn't make any difference if we were louder. But it really didn't. It was a very interesting thing. Okay, then a very little effect, but actually somewhat significant. When the monks started to be ordained priests. Now, Benedict, when he founded the Benedictines in the 5th century, he said specifically in his rule, how many monks should be ordained? Enough for the needs of our community. Eventually, everybody got ordained. So what happened? Well, you had to have a room with 20 altars, every one of them facing the wall. That causes a certain feeling. And I don't know if Ed had this feeling when we went to Rome, but when I first went to the graduate school there in the house where we lived in, on the Via del Umiltà, the way of humility, okay? We did a room like that, and there were about 20 altars and so on. And I was shown that room and said, you can have daily Mass here, okay? And then they usually had two of the, call them cameriere, the guys who sort of took care of the door and invited people. But they came early, and two of them would serve about 15 Masses. It was fascinating. The run from one altar to the other and pour the wine, and then over to another and change the book and so on. Somebody said, well, how often did you say Mass there? Once. And then I found there was a group of priests who got together. We couldn't concelebrate. That's before concelebration. But there was about 10 or 12 of them, and they would get together for common Mass and then take turns. Once every 12 days, you got to say Mass. So that's what I did after that. But those were some of the influences that turned the priest around. Okay? And isn't it amazing? That stayed with us till the Vatican Council. Remarkable, I think, in some ways. But we got used to it, and the Mass certainly was, because we kept it in Latin, a dramatic mystery. Now, it is a dramatic mystery, but it became so much more that than it was a community meal. You know. So, what does the future hold in that regard? Can we capture a little bit more of that notion that it really is a community meal? Now, Andrew Greeley has some very interesting observations that he makes about one of the next things that takes place. Once we are in beautiful church buildings, what becomes a great Catholic interest is visible external signs of religion. Much more so than many religions. Isn't it true? We love statues, stained glass windows. We love incense, holy water. We love vestments of all kinds. We really get into that. And then, in the Feast of the Saints, okay, a little different kind of rituals for each saint and so on. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but we really start to dive into that, okay? And, of course, the Protestant religions don't do that. When I was at Our Lady of Grace, we had a Reformed Lutheran church up the street from us. They had no candles, no stained glass windows, no statues, no crucifix, no vestments. What did they have? I asked the pastor. He said, "We have the Word of God and preaching." I said, "Well, we got about 26 things after that." Now, here's what Greeley said. Now, he said half tongue-in-cheek, but he also was somewhat serious. Remember, if you don't remember that name, he was a famous sociologist, did all these studies. He said, this has become a Catholic instinctive direction. He even said with a smile on his face, he said, "I have become to feel it's genetic." It's sort of inside our people. But it is true. Now, a lot of that is very good. External things really do move us, inspire us towards valuable insights and so on. Well, we did many, many things then. One of the most interesting things is, in the 4th century, do you know, we never had a celebration of Christmas. Well, now that we're out in the open, we decided to have one. How did Christmas originate? How did we pick December 25th? Did somebody do some studies? Not at all. You know how we did it? The Romans had a feast they called the Feast of the Unquenchable or Unconquerable Sun. And it was also a feast that sort of kept certain lewd traditions in place. And so, now in the open, with Constantine kind of supporting us, we put Christmas on top of that feast to erase it. And it was on December 25th. And it worked. And that's when we celebrated the birth of Christ. Now, another interesting thing took place. We had celebrated what we now call Easter, but they called then more the Paschal Feast, and the Paschal mystery from death to life. It was a one-day celebration where they celebrated the Passion, Death, Resurrection, Ascension. Why did they do that? Because it is, in some real sense, one continuous action. Okay. Well, here's what happened. After the persecutions, for the first time, generally, Christians felt free to visit the Holy Land. To go visit the Holy Land, make yourself publicly, especially in the reign of Diocletian or some of the other Roman emperors, that was almost inviting death, martyrdom. After the Edict of Milan, it was easy to go. And when they went, of course, people went with great enthusiasm. And they saw the place where at least it was said, this is where Pilate judged Jesus. And then they saw the place where maybe he was crucified, and so on. So, when they came back, they wanted to celebrate each of those individual events. And instead of one day, gradually, we had a Holy Week, where each day did one part of the celebration. The supper on Thursday, Passion and Death on Friday, the absence of Christ on Saturday, the resurrection on Sunday. And the one feast became 4. And I don't know about you when you were growing up, many of you are younger than I am, but I knew that on Good Friday you did not smile. You know? Now, do you know the recent Good Friday liturgy mentions the resurrection twice? What a movement that is. Demetrius Dumm, the famous Benedictine scholar and the best teacher I ever had, Demetrius Dumm said, there is something very wise about always keeping that together. And here's the way he put it. He says, the passion and death without the resurrection is a sad story. The resurrection without the passion and death is a beautiful image. But you put them together, and what do you have? You have the mystery of Christ through suffering, bringing us back to life. And he says, the way to really understand every one of those steps is to put them together. Now, I know we'll never do that again. And Holy Week, you know, I'm not criticizing, does a lot of beautiful things for us. Okay? But is there some truth in that? Is it really one continuous mystery? We did develop the term, the Paschal mystery. Okay. So I just put that out too for your wonderment. And what could the future possibly hold? Okay. Now the next thing that happened was the development of the liturgical books. Okay, we did have the Roman canon. That was developed. And by the way, notice none of this was the Pope giving a decree. How did all these things get organized? The experience of the community led by the bishops or led by the local leaders. They developed. Okay? And here's what my one instructor, who was really good in this, said. When they were developing, like, their way of saying the Mass, somebody would say, did you hear about the way they're doing this down in Antioch? Send somebody down there. And it did become a bit of a collegial thing because it wasn't, you know, the way we do it now. You get somebody defining a way that it's supposed to be done. Okay? So what was developed in that early period, the 4th, 5th century, maybe even into the 6th, was books called the Sacramentaries. And the Sacramentaries were local books, the Leonine Sacramentary, the Gregorian one, Gelasian, and so on, that had pretty much the whole structure of the Mass with all the prayers, the way we are doing it here. Okay? And eventually, that does give us some solidity for what we are doing, okay? And eventually leads towards a more communal way of doing the Mass. Now, one of the things that happens in the later period of the first millennium, 7th, 8th, 9th century, for some reason or other, there develops a greater emphasis on sinfulness, on the darkness of the human spirit, how we are all sinners. Now, one of the interesting ways that influences the way we approach Mass is that communion becomes less frequent. And actually, pretty generally in some areas, you didn't go to communion unless you went to the Sacrament of Penance first. Now, I knew some people who still did that in the 20th century, you know, so they'd feel right. Okay. Now, just a word on that, by the way. I don't expect you would know this. Do you know that the first practice of the Church for the first 500 years was you went to the Sacrament of Reconciliation once in your lifetime? That was it. It was like baptism. You were baptized and brought into, if you ruined your baptism, you got one chance. Okay? And Tertullian said, and please don't use this sacrament until the fires of youth have been quelled within you. He actually wrote that. Well, the reason why we got private repeated confession was after the barbarian invasions, as we called them, 4th, 5th century and so on, Ireland was not influenced by that, so the Irish monks became almost like the new missionaries. And they came down to various parts of the continent where Christianity had been really disturbed by the barbarian invasions, I guess you could say reconverted, and they had developed a spiritual direction process that included private confession. Now, you could do that. I mean, the church, everybody's separate, we didn't have internet or anything. They did that. And when they came down, they started doing it. And of course, the traditionalists on the continent said, that is not the intention of the apostles. Well, there's not much in the scriptures that says once in a lifetime. So you had this conflict, okay? Well, what happened was this. One of the popes finally decided, we've got to stay with a standard way. So with the emperor, he decreed for all of continental Christianity that once in a lifetime reconciliation is what Jesus taught. And the emperor said, and therefore we will have a book burning of all the penitentials of the Irish monks so that they can't continue. So they did have it. And you know what happened? Less than 50 years later, the once in a lifetime disappeared. Why? The touch on the people from that practice of the Irish monks was so effective, so meaningful, and in their view, so scriptural, that it couldn't be overcome by a decree. Remarkable kind of thing. Now, we notice that a lot in the development of the Mass. Much of the change comes from the people really feeling uplifted, and moved in a certain direction. Now, I have to say, where I discovered that a lot was in campus ministry. I mean, students would come up with some really interesting things. And in the places I was, especially LaRoche College, I had a large following of lay people from local parishes that came. And they were really moved by what the students were doing. And, some people would say, is this legal? And I said, well, canon law is a very interesting thing in it. Canon 27. It's my favorite canon. You know what it is? Custom is the best interpreter of law. It's in canon law. Now, canon law applies to liturgy, except in those specific cases where liturgy just says something else. But it does. And that goes all the way back. That's a Roman legal principle, all the way back to Rome. I think it's a wonderful principle. Why? Because people discover what really moves them and touches them and develop customs. As long as they don't contradict the scriptures or any of our dogma. Yeah, wonderful thing. Custom is the best interpreter of law. Tell you a quick story about that. When I was running that special program at Notre Dame, and it was a renewal program for priest sisters and full-time lay ministers. Well, whenever people would come in, and I had people always from Africa, Latin America, and so on all over. And I said, in one of the opening times, I would say, now, some of you have different customs and different ways of, and I forgot to turn my phone off, and I will get to it very quickly if I don't find it. So hard when you got other stuff on. Yeah, I'll call you back. Now, as I was saying, What the heck point was I making? Darn it, oh well, okay.
Canon 27.
Pardon me?
Canon 27.
Canon 27, custom is the best interpreter of law. This happened. I said, now look, a lot of you have different customs. And you come to a program like this and you say, well, I know they're doing that in Africa, but they shouldn't doing that. I said, learn from everybody else. See what you can learn. Because after all, we have a principle in canon law, custom is the best interpreter of law. So, we talked about it a little bit. There was a canon lawyer whom I had met. It was the first day, but I'd met him, a really nice guy, sitting right up front. And I said, Bill, am I saying this accurately? He said, what would you say as a canon lawyer? He said, yes, you're saying it accurately, but you didn't say it strongly enough. I was a little surprised. I said, what do you mean? He said, you made it sound like we have all of canon law. We have this principle out here. He said, that's not true. He said, we have all canon law, and the principle is inside the law. The principle is the law. What does that mean? You have to obey it. I never thought of that. But he said, that's true. That's why we put it in the law, not just as the reflection of legal people. I don't know how many times I've used that with the bishop. Sometimes. Okay. Well, okay, what I've described in some sense is how the Mass moved from the home meal to the grand drama. Okay? And that would take us up to, well, because it's continuing, up to the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century, and so on. And then the next time I come, I'm going to be talking about, some of the things that happened then, after that. Now, a few final things. And I got on this and then I didn't finish it. I said this sense of sinfulness grew very strongly, really influenced, as I said, frequent communion. You know what else it influenced? If the Eucharist, the supper of the Lord, the breaking of the bread, was a meal, how did people eat it? With their hands. Well, when this overtone of sinfulness came, they said, we are not worthy to touch the bread. And in 878, at a small council called the Council of Rouen, R-O-U-E-N, declared for the whole church that you must receive on the tongue. And that lasted until 1964. Isn't that amazing? We started out as a community meal. Okay? Well, that's how life can develop. So, that's my general view of the beginning, where many of these things came from. And then we do have to decide, are they still valuable? And how much can we do about that? Well, it all depends where you live. But sometimes custom really does start to influence those in charge of the law, because it is the law.